Okay, guys, in the last lesson, chapter 19, we talked about industries coming to America and new inventions creating all these jobs. In today's lesson, chapter 20, 1 and 2, we're going to talk about how these new industries affect cities and why people start moving to the cities and moving out of the country, and why immigrants come to America seeking a better life. Stay healthy. By 1850, early in America's history, most people are living in farms and small villages. So most people are living in the country. What's going to happen as time is going to go, cities are going to become more advanced and more people are going to start moving to the cities for multiple reasons. And we're going to talk about why that change happened in today's lesson. So by about 1900, 40% of the population was living within the cities. People were drawn to the cities for many different reasons. One main reason is the cities were exciting and they had things to do. Instead of spending all evening on your farm, you could go out into the city and there would be activities, to kill time with. The main reason people were moving there, though, was to find jobs. All those inventors we talked about in the last lesson, their new inventions required production. They required factories to be built. So as the industries grew, they built these giant factories. Most of them were in the cities or near the cities. So people moved there to find these jobs. The factories were usually going to be built towards or near a railroad or near a river. And the reason why that was so they could ship out their completed products relatively easily. American cities usually specialize in one or two industries. And specialize means to excel in one area. So if you have a math question, you're probably not going to ask me. You're going to go ask Miss Perone. If you have a science question, you're going to ask Miss Brodzinski. If you have a history question, since that's my area of specialty, you would come and ask me. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Youngstown, Ohio both specialized in making steel. Cleveland became important because John D. Rockefeller was refining oil. Chicago, Illinois grew because of the meat packing industry. And remember, they started shipping the meat on those refrigerated train cars so it could last longer and they could sell to a wider area. All of these cities are going to grow when the railroad starts to connect them together and the industries start to expand. The railroads are a good way to move product from one end of the country to the other. It's relatively cheap and it's quick. So the cities were no longer isolated. They were connected by these railroads. So as these industries grow, they're going to need more workers. And these large factories are going to have hundreds or thousands of people working there. And these factories, instead of making just one or two an item at a time, they do something called mass production. And that's where they make very large quantities of something. And the more of something a factory makes at one time, the lower the price gets, and they're able to sell things for more and make a larger profit. So all these people are trying to get jobs, and there's lots of competition. So what happens though? Since so many people need a job, the bosses or the employers know they don't have to pay the workers very well. If you think about it, it would be like 10 people are all applying for the same job. We'll say it's $10 an hour. And there's only 3 positions open at the factory. What might happen is one of the workers might say that they would do the job for $8 an hour. And if somebody else is desperate enough, they could undercut them again. So many people were desperate for these jobs that oftentimes the prices or the wages would go way down. Many workers are going to earn less than $10 a day and they're working 60 hours a week. That's about a 50% longer work week than most full-time jobs today. Working in these factories was often very dangerous too. They didn't have insurance and workman's comp like we do today. The machines are very dangerous, and the bosses or the employers, they believe it's your responsibility to protect yourself. So like today, if you're working in a factory and something malfunctions and you get injured, usually that factory is going to pay for your injury and you would get some compensation for it. But back then, if you got hurt in a factory, you would get blamed, you would probably get fired, and you would get nothing for it. Many of these factories were also employing children for multiple reasons. The children worked for very little money, sometimes cents a week, and they were used because they had smaller hands. They were able to get into smaller spaces that adults couldn't get into. So they were doing very dangerous work as well. So in this picture, you can get an idea of just how young some of the children working in the factories actually were. So let's take a look at lesson 2. The Statue of Liberty was a gift the United States got from France. And one of the reasons they gave it to us was to celebrate our alliance that we've had in past conflicts. It's one of the first things that immigrants would see when they were coming to America, because a lot of them ended up going through Ellis Island in New York. So here you can see some pictures of the Statue of Liberty being built. When we got it as a gift, it came in 300 pieces and had to be assembled. We didn't know if we'd actually be able to afford to build it. And here you can see it completed in its original color, copper, and over time it turned the green color we know today. They were coming here for all kinds of reasons, looking for freedom, looking for jobs, or just an opportunity to have a better life. When they would arrive, they would be inspected, and sometimes if they were sick or looked to be unhealthy, they would be sent back home. So coming to America was a big risk that a lot of them were willing to take. At Ellis Island, sometimes their names would be changed, be shortened, be made easier for other Americans to say. Getting into the United States is very difficult for most immigrants. A ticket would cost almost their entire life savings, and when they could finally afford a ticket, they would have to get a ticket in the cheapest section of the boat, which was called steerage. They would be riding right next to the engine room. There'd be no windows, no ventilation, and it was not a pleasant place to be. It would be crowded, it would be full of sick people, there wouldn't be enough food, and they would be on that boat for weeks at a time. But they were willing to put up with all of that for a chance to come to America and have a better life. Most of the immigrants coming to America before the 1880s were from England, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, and Norway, and they were known as the old immigrants. Not because they were older, but because their people have been here for a longer time. During the 1880s, more than 500,000 new immigrants came from Italy, Russia, Poland, and Greece. So the immigrants came for many reasons. Some of them were farmers. Others came to America to escape laws that were unfair. Some came for religious freedom. Almost half the people coming over from this time came from Poland and Russia, and they were Jewish. There was a law called the Homestead Act of 1862 that offered cheap land to immigrants. Now, this law was a little bit shady because it did something kind of dishonest. It advertised this land as being cheap, being very good property for you to come and build a house and start a new life. But what happened was by the time most of the immigrants had got here, that land had been sold and there was none left. So when they were unable to get any of this cheap land, many of them had to move into the cities. So what they were doing would be offering up this cheap land, getting you all the way over here, and then there's nothing left. That would be like if a store was selling slices of pizza, and they said a slice of pizza is 25 cents a piece. People would be rushing there. But let's say they got a line out the door, and only the first 20 people get those slices for a quarter a piece. They're hoping that everybody is going to stay and pay full price because they already made the trip. And that's kind of what happened here. A lot of these immigrants had already made the trip and they were unable to go back. So what problems did they face? Once they got here, most of them could not speak English and they did not have very much money left. That ticket in steerage wiped out their life savings. They worked some of the hardest jobs. They would clean the streets, they would pave the streets. A lot of them helped build the skyscrapers, and there was no safety equipment building these giant skyscrapers. A lot of them would be seriously injured or die doing this dangerous work. Women worked in clothing factories, and those were not safe either. Many of these immigrants experienced discrimination too. So they came here to be free, but they were not treated as well as other people. Immigrants from Asia had settled on the West Coast, mainly towards like California, and a lot of them were being denied jobs, which was unfair because they had put in a lot of hard work to help build the railroads that connected all of these major cities. In 1882, Congress passed a law saying no more Chinese immigrants were allowed to come to America. Here's a couple of pictures showing the dangerous work the immigrants were willing to do to get a chance in America. The largest group of immigrants came from Italy. Most of them were men. And they had a different plan than some of the people. They planned to work in America, make a bunch of money, and then return home to their families. So they wanted to take advantage of the situation, make as much money as they could, and then go back home. Now the Jewish immigrants, they were in a different position. A lot of them left their countries because they were being discriminated against. They were being persecuted. So they left with no plans to return. A lot of American people did not like the immigrants. They were ignorant towards the different reasons why the immigrants had come here. They were afraid that the immigrants were taking the jobs and the work. They were afraid that they would work for less money and they would basically steal the jobs from them. They didn't like dealing with people who didn't speak the same language as them, and they did not trust many of the immigrants. Which is ironic because most of their families were immigrants if they'd go back just a couple of generations. So what other groups faced discrimination then? It wasn't just the immigrants. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 made segregation in public places against the law. So they made it illegal to have separate sections for white and black people. But in 1883, the Supreme Court reversed that decision, which basically meant they were allowed to separate things based on white and black again. So laws called Jim Crow laws were passed. And these laws mainly affected the South, and they set up separate places or separate facilities for white and black Americans. So when they did this, they justified it by saying the separate facilities were separate, but they were equal. So they were supposed to be exactly the same quality, and that's not what happened. Almost 100% of the time, actually every single time, the facilities that the black Americans or the African Americans were getting were far worse than what the white Americans were getting. They were never truly treated as equal. So this issue of segregation gets brought to the Supreme Court again. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, said that the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments, apply to all Americans, African Americans and whites. So the court agreed this time. They said that's true, but that only applies to the government and not individuals. So what that means is the government was not allowed to segregate or discriminate, but private businesses or regular citizens were allowed to. Once the court decided this, segregation spread and became even more common in the South. So a famous court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, happens during this time. In Louisiana, they passed a law that required train cars to have separate sections for white and black Americans. A guy named Homer Plessy decided this was not fair and he wanted to test it. He got in the white section of the train and refused to move. So what happened is he ended up being arrested, and he was saying that it was not equal. He said that he was not being treated the same as other Americans, and his rights, or his civil rights, were being denied. So he went to court, and he was found guilty. If you're not happy with your court case, you can ask for an appeal. So he appeals his case to the highest court in the country, the United States Supreme Court. He says that the Louisiana law violates the Constitution, and nothing is ever allowed to violate the Constitution. He said the 14th Amendment forbids states to discriminate. The Supreme Court looks at his case and they disagree. The Supreme Court says that the Louisiana law was completely allowed, and they were allowed to have separate but equal facilities. So what this did, when other places heard the Supreme Court agreed with Louisiana, it basically gave them a license to keep spreading segregation and allow this racism to grow. It ends up taking quite a long time before this decision ever gets reversed. Years and years and years. We won't talk about that for multiple chapters. Okay, guys. So what you're going to do now, you're going to go into Google Classroom, and you are going to do the worksheet that goes along with Chapter 20, Lesson 1 and 2. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll do the best I can to help you out.